What if the most powerful military on the planet spent 48 days and billions of dollars trying to solve a problem and a single phone call to a naval commander solved it in 72 hours instead? That is not a hypothetical. That is exactly what just happened, and the implications of how it happened will reshape every military and diplomatic calculation on Earth for the next 50 years. Stay with me because the next 3 minutes will change how you see this entire conflict permanently. The most formidable military force ever assembled spent 48 days striking Iranian mountain ranges. It never reached the uranium. A sealed waterway accomplished in 72 hours what aerial bombardment could not achieve in 7 weeks. For 4.5 decades it was untouchable, not negotiable, not discussable, not even mentionable at a diplomatic gathering without Iran's representatives walking out of the room entirely. The enriched uranium stockpile that Iran invested decades constructing defended through suffocating economic sanctions, protected through the excavation of underground fortresses buried 90 meters into solid mountain bedrock was the singular asset the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps designated as sacred. The boundary that would never shift, the line that Iran's military leadership declared publicly, repeatedly, and with absolute institutional conviction they would accept complete destruction before crossing. On April 16, 2026, that line moved. According to a formal statement from President Trump, Iran has agreed not to pursue or possess nuclear weapons and to surrender its accumulated stockpiles of enriched uranium. Iran does not have a nuclear weapon, and they have agreed to that, agreed to it very powerfully. The uranium that Iran had enriched to 60% purity. The uranium representing material sufficient for more than 10 nuclear warheads. The uranium that Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States had spent years publicly identifying as their most consequential strategic nightmare. The uranium that the IRG elevated to a symbol of national sovereignty and civilizational resistance. The uranium buried beneath mountain ranges that the world's most powerful military spent months attempting to reach with the heaviest bunker-penetrating munitions ever manufactured. Iran agreed to surrender it. And here is what makes this moment genuinely extraordinary beyond the military dimension consuming most analytical attention. America did not secure this outcome through the commando operation the Pentagon had developed. It did not achieve it through airborne divisions parachuting into hostile territory. It did not accomplish it through special operations forces in protective equipment descending 90 meters through collapsed tunnel systems to physically extract uranium cylinders from fortified underground chambers. It accomplished it by closing a waterway, by turning time itself into a weapon directed at a regime until that regime calculated correctly that uranium, without a functioning economy, is strategically worthless, that nuclear leverage means nothing when food imports have ceased, oil revenues have evaporated, and the national treasury has days of operational capacity remaining. Subscribe now and activate notifications because what just transpired in Iran is not simply a military story or a diplomatic story. It is the story of how the most strategically consequential concession any nation has made in decades was extracted not through force but through systematic economic suffocation, and what it means for the regime's internal stability, for regional security architecture, and for the future trajectory of this conflict is something that current coverage is failing to adequately explain. To grasp the true magnitude of what Iran just agreed to, you must understand what that uranium actually represented not in purely technical terms, but in existential institutional terms that defined the Islamic Republic's strategic identity for nearly half a century. The 2015 nuclear agreement, when it remained operational, constrained Iranian uranium enrichment to 3.67% purity with a total stockpile ceiling of 300 kilograms maintained under continuous international inspection. Iran was in compliance. Enrichment levels were contained, the breakout timeline. The duration experts calculated Iran would require to accumulate sufficient weapons-grade material for a functional nuclear device was measured in years of lead time. Then Washington withdrew from the agreement during Trump's first presidential term, and Iran progressively released every constraint it had accepted. Enrichment climbed first to 20%, then to 60% purity. By mid-2025, Iran had accumulated over 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% sufficient material for more than 10 nuclear warheads. The breakout timeline that had previously been measured in years had effectively collapsed toward zero. A single technical decision, a single engineering authorization, and Iran possessed a weapon. According to International Inspection Agency documentation, this stockpile was distributed across 3 underground installations representing the most heavily protected military infrastructure any regional power had ever constructed. Natanz, embedded within mountain geology behind layered concrete and radiation shielding, Isfahan. Holding approximately half the total stockpile within tunnel networks exceeding 90 meters in depth. Fordo, constructed entirely inside a mountain specifically engineered to resist direct aerial bombardment of any conventional variety. Military strikes conducted in mid-2025 inflicted severe structural damage across all 3 installations. Tunnel access points were collapsed under rubble. Ventilation infrastructure was severed. Entry ramps were buried under thousands of tons of displaced rock and concrete, but the uranium itself remained physically intact and chemically unchanged. Uranium enriched to 60% purity does not diminish through radioactive decay on any human-relevant timeline. It retains that enrichment level for centuries. The strikes had eliminated the physical infrastructure surrounding the program. They had not resolved the uranium problem that the program represented. Given sufficient time and resources, Iran retained the institutional knowledge and engineering capacity to reconstruct. And if Iran successfully crossed the nuclear threshold despite everything, the cascade effect that Western intelligence agencies had been projecting for years would activate immediately. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey would face intense and immediate domestic political pressure to initiate parallel nuclear development programs. A regional nuclear proliferation dynamic across the most geopolitically volatile geography on the planet would transition from theoretical risk assessment to active operational planning assumption across every relevant defense ministry simultaneously. Trump did not execute the ground operation plan. He identified something more strategically effective than the most ambitious special operations mission in American military history, something that required 0 American casualties, no aircraft losses, no soldiers in radiation protective equipment, no weeks of underground combat, and Iranian mountain geology. He closed a waterway. On April 13th, U.S. Central Command declared comprehensive interdiction of Iranian port access through the Strait of Hormuz. Within the first 24 hours, not a single vessel completed transit. By April 16th, 14 ships had attempted to challenge the enforcement perimeter. Every single one was redirected without exception, including Chinese-flagged commercial tankers attempting passage under alternative registration with falsified tracking signals. The mathematical consequences for Iran were immediately catastrophic. Over 157 million barrels of Iranian crude sat stranded with no viable delivery pathway. More than 90% of Iran's total annual maritime trade volume severed through a single operational declaration, and Iran's leadership performed. The calculation this confrontation was always ultimately going to reduce itself to: without petroleum revenue, the regime cannot sustain military payroll; without food imports, civilian streets become ungovernable; without medicine and industrial materials, the basic operational requirements of a society conducting war simultaneously collapse into compounding crisis. The uranium enrichment program, the defining achievement of 45 years of sustained strategic investment, means nothing to a regime that cannot survive the next 10 days of economic strangulation. Uranium functions as a bargaining instrument. Hormuz represented a matter of immediate regime survival. Iran came to the negotiating table, and what it brought was the uranium. Inside Tehran at this moment, 2 competing power centers exist, and they have been conducting an internal institutional conflict for weeks with accelerating intensity. President Masoud Pezeshkian entered this conflict with a foundational orientation toward negotiated resolution. His consistent position has been to transfer the uranium, secure the blockade's termination, and preserve the regime's structural functionality through survival in a diminished but operational state. A regime that survives in reduced circumstances retains the capacity to eventually rebuild. A regime that collapses completely forfeits every future option simultaneously. On the opposing institutional pole stands the IRG command structure. Senior IRG leadership has been actively obstructing presidential administrative functions, occupying intelligence ministry positions through direct appointment, and applying sustained pressure on the Supreme National Security Council. The IRG is not currently functioning as a military organization subordinate to civilian governmental authority. It is operating as a parallel governing power. The IRG faces 3 available choices, and every option represents a form of institutional loss. Accept the handover and preserve some pathway toward organizational survival, even at the cost of the existential narrative that defined the institution's purpose. Sabotage the agreement and invite the full application of every military option currently being held in reserve. Attempt internal consolidation of power through direct confrontation with the civilian government in a regime whose military capacity has been degraded by an estimated 70% under continuous bombardment. The uranium that defined Iranian strategic identity for 45 years was not retrieved by special forces. It was not seized by airborne divisions. It was not physically extracted by soldiers navigating collapsed underground tunnels. Iran brought it to the negotiating table voluntarily because a naval blockade made the alternative. To negotiation, not military defeat, but total economic collapse. The math prevailed over the mythology. Subscribe now and activate notifications as every development in this uranium handover unfolds. Do you believe the IRG ultimately complies or moves to sabotage the agreement and force a decisive confrontation? Leave your assessment in the comments below.